Let me say one more word of welcome to the Tower Center, to SMU, to this fabulous museum which hosts our conferences here on campus, and all of the great art, including some of it that's a little risque that's in this room that we're in right now. But let me just reiterate something I said last night. I want to repeat it again today at lunch. The Tower Center National Security Program was designed to bring the debate about national security policy and defense, to get it outside the Beltway, off the East Coast, out here to the heartland where so much of the action is with respect to our military, defense industry. So we have a big stake in understanding what's going on. Today at lunch, we have another opportunity to get one of those Beltway types outside of Washington, lure him out here to the Lone Star State, and I promise you, Michael, we're not going to secede, I don't think. Michael O'Hanlon. Michael O'Hanlon is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He is involved in the 21st Century Defense Initiative at Brookings. He's a director of research in the very prestigious foreign policy program at the Brookings Institutions, a leading expert on the politics of use of force, military force. I know many of you in this room have seen him on TV. You've heard him on the radio, probably read him in the newspaper. He is one of those rare individuals. I often like to say this, having spent many years of my life in Europe, specifically in France, where there's a great emphasis placed on the intellectual, the role of the intellectual in society. He is a true public intellectual, not just a scholar, but he's bringing his ideas and his scholarship to the public square. He has written many books, many famous books. I'll just mention a couple of them. Most recently, a book called Bending History, which is on Obama's foreign policy. So this will warm you up for some of the questions you can ask him later. Here's a good title, Wounded Giant, American Armed Forces in an Age of Austerity. Boy, that's a perfect book, perfect title for what we're discussing here. The case, A Skeptic's Case for Nuclear Disarmament, those are just three of his many publications. He's also been heavily involved in the making of U.S. national security and foreign policy. If you all would please join me in giving a warm Lone Star welcome to Michael O'Hanlon.
Thank you. That was way too kind. Although the last time I was called an intellectual in an introduction, my wife laughed. So, but she's not here today, and in fact, she's in Washington. And I have to say, it's even nicer to be away from Washington than it usually is when we get to say that coming down to Texas. And it's not just because of the Redskins that I mean that this year. So, thank you for the opportunity to be here this week. I've really been enjoying the conference. When I was first asked to speak, I was thinking about talking on defense budgeting. And I'd love to get to that in the discussion, but then I looked at the program as it was shaping up, and I saw that you had General Cartwright in the morning, you had David Chu in the afternoon. One thing you don't want to do really is have your homework graded by David Chu. And so, even though, again, I hope we can go into these discussions a little bit later, I decided to go in a little different direction. And by the way, others have been fantastic, General Dunn, Bob Scales, the industry panel. It's just been really great to be part of this today. What I decided to talk about was the U.S.-China relationship, which has to be seen, I think, as central to all the topics that we're actually discussing today. And we might as well just go straight at it with one part of the program because we're all thinking about it, referring to it, have it on our minds. And so I thought I would speak about it. And the reason why I decided to begin the discussion with that subject as well is that I have the great privilege right now of doing a book on the U.S.-China relationship with Jim Steinberg. And let me just say a word about the motivation and then lead into some of the ideas that we're working through. And also ask you to treat these ideas as draft ideas, and if you want to blame anybody, You know, just like Obama said yesterday, blame me, not Rice, blame me, not Steinberg, for this, because we're still working through this. But Jim was Hillary Clinton's deputy until last spring and had a lot of the China portfolio. And he had a little bit of a frustrating experience in some ways, because in that first year, he gave a big speech on a concept that he called strategic reassurance, which is what he hoped would be the nature of the U.S.-China relationship. And actually, there were some people in town, in the administration, who liked the idea of strategic trust as a motto for what we should be doing with the Chinese. And Jim said, no, that's too optimistic. Strategic reassurance is also more of an active process. It's what we should be trying to do, not the state we can expect to reach. Unfortunately for Jim, as much as I think these ideas were very good, just about when he gave this speech is when we saw the Chinese doing the most egregious things, you know, again, not horrible by the standards of history or by the standards of great powers, but still problematic in the context of our relationships with allies. Everything from getting pushier with South China Sea and East China Sea islands to, in early 2010, not even really reprimanding the North Koreans when they killed 46 South Korean sailors in cold blood and sank the Chonan and then shelled the small island off the coast, killing 4 more South Koreans. Chinese were very reluctant even to penalize North Korea gently in that situation. And then we all know that they've been getting a little pushier towards Southeast Asian countries, reminding them that China's big and they're small, and getting upset whenever we have a position on how these disputes over these small uninhabitable rocks should perhaps be resolved patiently, and our even saying that much has been a source of further contention. And then, of course, the Chinese weren't quite sure what to make of Obama, and as we say in this book that you kindly mentioned, Bending History, which I did with Martin Indyk, who's my boss and a Middle East scholar, and Ken Lieberthal, who's a China scholar, what the Chinese interpreted from Obama in that first year was, here's a freshman senator. People were saying he was the most liberal member of the Senate. He talked a lot about peace and hope and change. Let's give him a little bit of good old-fashioned Chinese realpolitik and get in his face a little bit and show a little bit of disrespect towards this guy. And all that was sort of happening in 2009, and you'll recall the climate conference in Copenhagen and a few other things where that seemed to be the style of the Chinese leadership towards the United States. So Jim didn't get very far with strategic reassurance. And then, of course, what he did better with, as the whole administration, I think, did the next couple of years, was pivoting and rebalancing. Because after about a year of this, what the Chinese might have found out, that a lot of other people have found out about Obama, whether you like him or not, he's actually not a pushover. He actually can get pretty argumentative and pretty firm in his views, and he decided that he wasn't that thrilled with the Chinese. And any effort to establish a stronger partnership as the two great powers, the one established superpower and the one up-and-coming superpower, that was going to have to be put on hold a bit. And economic issues probably drove this as much as military or strategic issues. But nonetheless, Obama got a lot tougher. And then when Hillary also got a little bit involved in this, you started to see that these supposedly very liberal and soft Democrats could actually get pretty firm towards the PRC. And so we saw the policy of pivoting and rebalancing. It's an interesting policy because, as many of you know, it actually doesn't involve that much substantive change in our military deployments. We're making a big deal out of putting a couple thousand Marines in Darwin. Darwin, by the way, is still a long ways from China, so it's not as if you're really getting a whole lot of added military capability. In some various ideas that David Chu and others have been pursuing in previous administrations, we see a continual increase in our capability on Guam, which I think is very smart policy. But again, it was an ongoing sustaining and continuation of some ideas that had been in the works for a while, and it was relatively modest in terms of the next steps that Obama's been talking about. And then we saw Secretary Panetta go to the Shangri-La conference down in Southeast Asia last spring, and I hope David might comment on this, or some of the rest of you, because we saw some very creative use of defense statistics in this speech by Secretary Panetta, because what he said is to give the rebalancing towards the Asia-Pacific some more meat. What the United States is now going to do is to base 60% of its entire Navy on the Pacific coast of the United States, whereas historically it had been closer to a 50-50 or even less in terms of the Pacific over the years. Now, the interesting thing about that sounds pretty big and pretty bold, but as you know, the Persian Gulf is relatively equally accessible from either the Pacific or the Atlantic. And so since the Persian Gulf and the Western Pacific remain our two big areas where we send naval forces, the fact that you're going to base a few more in California does not necessarily predetermine how you're going to deploy them. And you still have a lot of flexibility in whether you actually change their end location or not. You may still wind up distributing the assets more or less as you have been, but you always have the symbolic and rhetorical option of saying, here's a big shift in capability because now we have these vessels based in San Diego instead of in Norfolk. Anyway, I think it's a good idea because in an era of limited resources, we have to make the most of what we've got. And I hope we'll come back to that defense budget discussion in a little bit. In fact, I will actually get into that now, but in the context of the U.S.-China relationship. Because here's what I want to do, and just make, I've given you now a big warm-up. Let me just give you a couple, three specific ideas about the U.S.-China relationship, and then hopefully just provoke some conversation. Jim and I are writing this book, in a sense, to flesh out what strategic reassurance means, or what it should mean. And there are two real important priorities for the book, but more importantly for the relationship. And I think one of them is to understand each other as well as possible, even though we're going to compete. The U.S.-China relationship is going to be a competitive relationship in many ways, economic, military, cultural, political. And we're going to compete, but the important thing is to compete without risking World War III. And that may sound obvious and axiomatic, but it's not a given. It's not a given that we're going to avoid it. Great powers in history have not typically avoided some kind of a clash. As General Scales and others know, there are a lot of people in the Pentagon and elsewhere who think it's likely, and I hope they're wrong, but there certainly is historical reason to think that we should worry. So one purpose of the book is to wrestle with the fact that both sides are going to be competing, but to try not to have either side view the other as inherently hostile just for that reason. It's a fine line to walk, but I'm going to come back to what I mean by that in just a second. The other purpose of the book is to look for opportunities where we can constrain the competition without actually, in any way, sacrificing or limiting our interests. And so we want to have the competition. We sort of want to win the competition in a friendly way. And I would argue we are winning the competition because China's become a lot more like us than we have like them over the half century that we've been trying to engage with them. And that essentially is what winning means and should mean in this context. And keeping stability along the way so that they don't get the wrong idea about ways they can use their newfound strength in aggressive fashions. But we have a couple ideas there. So let me just really talk about those two things. One is one of the ideas in the book about how we can understand each other a little bit better, and I want to focus on the defense budget issue for that. And then the other is where we can look to constrain the competition without abandoning any of our interests. And here I want to look at war plans. And here I have the advantage and disadvantage that I haven't seen the war plans. That may sound like a little strange thing to say. If I had seen the war plans, I couldn't talk about it with you, right? I could maybe I could talk about it with David or General Scales in a quiet room somewhere on a walk, but I couldn't talk about it here. But the disadvantage, obviously, is that I'm surmising what could be in them. And part of this is, I hope, informed speculation. But part of it is also, admittedly, creating a little bit of a straw man and saying, if the war plans are like this, that's good. If they're not like this, let's rethink them or be wary of where they could go. Because there is a danger here, and the danger is the following. Militaries like to fight on the offensive. Militaries do well when they fight on the offensive. And the U.S. military is getting very used to fighting on the offensive. Because we've been fighting, even though the counterinsurgency operations of the last 10 years have been a more complicated kind of issue. When we go out and we use force against a country like a Serbia or an Iraq or the Taliban-run Afghanistan, we go on the offensive, and we do it well, and it's in our DNA. And we've got to be wary about how this same tendency may be applied or misapplied to the U.S.-China relationship. So that's the other point I want to make. None of this is meant to make me sound, I hope, like a peacenik. And please, even if I come across that way, don't blame Jim. Because he took more heat for this concept already than he should have. And we're trying very carefully in the book to make it clear that we are not looking in any way, shape, or form to diminish this country's capability to firmly defend its allies and interests. In fact, Jim was an architect of rebalancing. He was an early implementer of rebalancing, and he fully supports it, even though it makes the Chinese mad as hell. And a question we have is, okay, you've made the Chinese mad as hell. That was probably necessary. It's probably not a sustainable strategy, probably not a desirable long-term strategy. Let's think hard about what comes next. I just want to give you one more sort of warm-up idea, and then I'll do these two things I promised and be done. The other warm-up idea, just to show where we're trying to come from, is that I know a number of people in this room are familiar with the new Navy Air Force concept of air-sea battle. And Jim and I are trying to address this in the book. And we wrote an op-ed this summer in the Washington Post in which we basically responded to a Washington Post news article that had attacked the idea of air-sea battle. And what Jim and I said is, you know what? As far as it goes, it's okay. Because as a military response to some trends that had been developing in the region, it was important for the Air Force and the Navy to tighten up their integration, their communications, their missile defense, their anti-submarine warfare efforts, to be cognizant of China's new capabilities to use precision strike munitions and more advanced submarines and anti-satellite weaponry against us. And we've got to be thinking in military terms about responses. We need better defenses. We need redundant systems or backup systems. We may need, in certain cases, to go on the offensive ourselves. But that's where the rub is, because we have to worry about how soon we go on the offensive and how we let crises potentially escalate. So that's where we sort of left off with the air-sea battle article, and I'll come back to that in just a second. But the point is we wrote an op-ed to basically defend the idea, which is not what you think of from strategic reassurers. So that's the context in which we try to operate. It's meant to be a hawkish approach towards diplomacy, if you will. Okay, defense budgets. Let me say a couple of things here. And again, I'm not really making a big recommendation. My bottom line on the defense budget, by the way, is that sequestration would cut it too much, that the Simpson-Bowles plan would cut it too much. And by the way, Simpson and Bowles did great work with their commission, as did my colleague Alice Rivlin, my favorite Brookings scholar of all time, when she teamed up with Pete Domenici and did another commission that same year. But they all, in my opinion, cut defense too much. They're all going to cut defense, if they have their way, another $500 billion over 10 years, above and beyond the cuts that are currently baked into the Obama defense plan, which Leon Panetta and Barack Obama have said is as far as we should go. But sequestration and the two big deficit reduction plans on the table right now would all cut roughly another $500 billion over 10 years. I think that's too much, but I do think we can probably cut another roughly $100 billion over 10 years. And that's just to give you a bumper sticker summary of my basic argument, which we can come back to if you like in discussion. But for the purposes of thinking about the US-China relationship, to some extent, it doesn't matter that much. Here's the basic storyline. The basic storyline, and I think, again, a number of you are familiar with this, but it bears repeating and summarizing. 20 years ago, when the Cold War ended, a number of people, and again, a lot of us in the room watched these debates or participated in them, but a lot of people were starting to say China's the big new thing, the big new power, maybe the big new threat. And we all read or consumed or produced these kinds of essays in the 1990s. But at that time, China's GDP was in 1/10 of the United States' GDP, and its military budget, equivalently speaking, once you converted it to dollars and used this concept of purchasing power parity to account for the fact that China's economy was a different kind of economy, its equivalent defense budget was maybe back then something like $30, $40, $50 billion a year. So it was starting to approach the ranks of of Russia, Japan, Britain, France, Germany, the other sort of medium powers that are roughly $50 billion a year defense establishments each, more or less. And then, of course, we go through the decade. China keeps growing, but so do we. So we're feeling a little better about our economy in the late 90s. And then, so we're not too worried about China. That whole literature sort of plateaued in intensity. And then 9/11 hits. And what happens on 9/11? We get distracted. We do other things for 10 years. Plus, we build up our defense budget enormously. And so any thinking that China's catching up to us is now sort of forgotten, because now we're up to spending close to $700 billion a year on our military, and China's starting to approach $100 billion. But, we're growing, the amount that we grew in our defense budgets in those early years after 9/11 was roughly equal to the size of the entire Chinese defense budget. So we're going from about $400 billion to $700 billion over about a 5-6 year period, and they go from $50 billion to $100 billion over a decade. They're basically doubling every decade. And that's what they've been doing. That's what they are probably going to keep doing for a while. Okay, now here we are, right? 2012. Starting with the Tea Party election of 2010, the Budget Control Act of 2011, the ongoing fiscal woes of 2012. Mitt Romney did not win the election, so we're not going to have the reversal of all of those Obama defense cuts, it would appear. And frankly, a lot of Republicans would not really have probably gone along with Romney, or at least not ultimately couldn't have stayed with him because you couldn't make the deficit go down if you did that. So it would have been an interesting dynamic had he won with his platform. I don't know how far he could really have pushed it. But in any event, he lost, and so we're on the Obama trajectory. And so now, as the wars are also ending, and again, many of you know this math very well, but we're down to sort of $600 billion a year in total military budgets, headed for something closer to $5 billion. Okay, now it's starting to get interesting because, meanwhile, China continues to ratchet it up year by year by year. And you can do these calculations a lot of different ways, and I'll be fascinated to hear if anybody in this room has a strong opinion on how to evaluate China's defense budget. But the most rigorous and I think the most detailed studies that I've seen put it at somewhere between $150 billion and $180 billion a year right now, once you translate into dollars and you do a purchasing power parity adjustment. And you count all the things in the Chinese defense establishment that we usually count within our defense budget, because in their accounting system, they don't count the same way, and they leave certain things out. So once you adjust for that, they're pushing $200 billion. And by the way, right now they're getting along pretty well with Russia. And even though they're sort of feeling each other out vis-a-vis India, and the Chinese and Indians have a looming rivalry